I think it's fair to say that a lot of people are attracted to a picture of truth that they like to call the correspondence theory of truth. And I guess I am one of these people. I also like to use the label the correspondence theory to describe the sort of view on truth that I myself favor. But of course, the correspondence theory isn't a particularly clear label. There are lots of views that go under this heading. Many of them are left very vague. So I thought I would make a video trying to lay out the view that I myself favor. The way that I like to tell it, the correspondence theory started off historically as a cluster of vague intuitions to the effect that truth is a matter of representing the world accurately in language or in thought. In past times, philosophers would try to make these intuitions more concrete by developing theories in metaphysics and ontology. They would try to cash out the correspondence intuition by developing a metaphysics of propositions and facts. And to be fair, some philosophers still do this today. That is, they approach the topic of truth from entirely within the purview of traditional metaphysics. But as I see it, as time went on, the efforts to precisify the correspondence intuition have evolved into several research programs that now belong to areas that are far beyond just philosophy. They belong to linguistics and logic and cognitive science, and then of course philosophy as well. The relevant areas of research are not fully complete. They are ongoing pursuits. But as I see it, they are all in the business of improving our understanding of truth, from the perspective of a correspondence theorist. Anyway, so that is how I like to view the correspondence theory of truth. One might say that the theory is a synthesis of several ongoing interdisciplinary research programs. Since I'm going to be outlining a theory of truth, I should say a little bit more about the questions that this view is attempting to answer. Ultimately, the concern of a correspondence theory is with the metaphysics of truth. Truth is a kind of property, after all, and we want to say what that property is. The aim is to say what the nature of the property of truth is and provide the sorts of explanations that can be given for when something is true. Suppose, for example, that I pick up a shiny piece of rock from a riverbed, and I display it in my hand for everyone in my vicinity to see. I then pronounce to my audience, "This is a piece of gold." According to our intuitive folk understanding of language, my pronouncement may be true or false, depending on various factors. Intuitively, it depends on what the sentence means and how things stand in the world, whether that particular rock in my hand is in fact a piece of gold. This reflects the general insight of the correspondence theory, that the truth of what I say depends on the worldly states that I represent. This intuition is fine as far as it goes, but the real hard problem for the theorist is to develop it into something that is more revelatory and systematic. Broadly speaking, everyone who writes on this topic can agree on just this much. Truth is a property borne by some sort of truth-bearing item, a proposition or a thought or a sentence, which generically we call a truth-bearer. The truth-bearers are each associated with conditions for their truth and falsity. These are called truth conditions and falsity conditions. They are true when their truth conditions are met, and they are false when they are not met, or when their falsity conditions are met. Although this might not sound like very much, it at least points us into the direction of the further questions that we need to ask. For one, we need to ask, what are the truth bearers? When I say this is a piece of gold, is the thing that is true or false my utterance, a particular vehicle of communication? Or is it the thought that I express with my utterance, a particular mental entity? Or is it something more abstract, like a proposition? That is, the thing that my sentence expresses as its meaning. For the second cluster of questions, we also need to ask what the truth conditions are. What is it that makes a truth bearer true? The generic answer from the correspondence theorist is that it has something to do with how things stand in the world. A truth bearer is true if it corresponds to reality, as the saying goes. But as we will see, this needs to be more precise and systematic. Since the truth bearers come in all sorts of varieties of and orders of complexity, we need a theory of truth conditions that reflects this variety. Finally, even if we can answer the previous two questions, there may still be a further explanatory task. We may also need to explain why the truth bearers are endowed with their particular truth conditions. Why, for instance, does my utterance of "this is gold" mean what it does, so that it is true if and only if the rock I hold is an instance of gold? Addressing each of these three clusters of questions is what I take to be required to, quote-unquote, explain the nature of truth. Okay, so I'm going to approach this topic by telling a little bit of history. The so-called correspondence theory of truth has a long history of being expressed in platitudes. In the beginning of philosophy, as we know it, Aristotle famously wrote that to say of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is false, while to say of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not, is true. That was the account of truth he gave in his Metaphysics. Sometime later, St. Thomas Aquinas claimed that truth consists in conformity between things and the intellect. And then later still, in almost recent memory, Bertrand Russell and G. E. Moore held that truth is a matter of beliefs corresponding to the facts. In each of their historical contexts, these platitudes were always used by these authors to signal rejection of some other more unpalatable view. These early correspondence theorists would say such things because they wanted to distance themselves from the idea that truth is in the eye of the beholder, or truth is a mere matter of opinion, or whatever is most useful to believe, or whatever coheres with the norms of inquiry, or some other relatively unattractive view like that. So, in order to explain the correspondence theory, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look at the views of Moore and Russell a bit more closely. The reason for this is because they developed their view into something a bit more systematic than their predecessors. So, when G. E. Moore laid out his theory of truth, he wrote, and here's the quotation, "To say that a belief is true is to say that there is in the universe a fact to which it corresponds. And to say that it is false is to say that there is not in the universe any fact to which it corresponds." So that's the definition of truth that Moore gave at some point in his career. And around the same time, Russell also gave a definition which says pretty much the same thing. Each of them held this view only briefly and changed their minds as well. But anyway, this is a statement of what is now known as the classical fact-based correspondence theory of truth. It is one way to give voice to the basic intuition that a belief is true when it accurately represents the relevant portion of reality. That is, that it corresponds to a fact. There are really three things that you should notice about the classical correspondence theory. The first, and perhaps most important for Moore and Russell, is that truth always requires the existence of a corresponding fact. Each time that something is true, it is because there exists something, the fact, that makes it true. This is one of the defining features of the classical correspondence theory. Truth is explained by postulating a local ontology of facts. The facts must exist in order to witness the truths. In short, Moore and Russell explain truth by giving an ontological theory, and the ontology is one that includes facts. Since this theory gets its mileage out of its ontology of facts, if we're going to understand it more fully, we need to ask the further question of what is a fact? To this question, both Moore and Russell give pretty much the same answer. For them, facts are understood as a kind of complex, structured entity that is composed of both particular objects and abstract universals. For example, the fact that I represent when I say this is a piece of gold will be some complex entity that is composed of the rock that's in my hand and the property of being a piece of gold. For lack of a better way of talking about these things, we might represent this fact as the ordered pair that's composed of this rock and the property of being a piece of gold. At any rate, it's the existence of this thing that is supposed to explain why it is true that this is a piece of gold. The second thing to say about the classical correspondence theory concerns the truthbearers, the things that are supposed to bear truth and falsity. You can see in the quotation that I gave earlier that Moore took them to be beliefs, and in fact Russell did the same thing as well. Each of them had their own peculiar reasons for this, but I think it's best if we don't even get into them. Putting the idiosyncrasies of Moore and Russell aside, I'll just say that it's more common nowadays to think of the truth-bearers for the classical correspondence theory as the objects of belief, that is, propositions. Now, what are propositions? Well, it's kind of hard to say. There's no non-controversial answer as to what a proposition is, and I'm not really going to get into it. The main thing to know for now is that propositions are allegedly supposed to be the objects of belief, the meanings of declarative sentences, as well as the bearers of correspondence relations and hence truth and falsity. The third and final thing to say about the classical correspondence theory has to do with the correspondence relation that is supposedly born between the true propositions and the facts. Proponents of this view need to say more about what this relation is. What, after all, does it mean for a proposition to correspond to a fact? When I say, this is a piece of gold, what relation does my statement bear to the gold that's in my hand and the facts that surround it? To even begin to answer this, it is common for the correspondence theorists to tell us more about the nature of propositions. Typically, they'll tell us that propositions have an internal structure to them. Perhaps a proposition that this is a piece of gold has a structure that reflects the subject-predicate form of my sentence. And it has constituents in it that represent the rock in my hand and a constituent that represents the property of being gold. Again, for lack of a better way of talking about these things, we can represent the proposition as an ordered pair that consists of, on the one hand, the representation of the rock, and on the other hand, the representation of the property of being gold. Once we say this much, we can then go on to understand the correspondence relation as a sort of isomorphism or a mirroring between proposition and fact. The idea is that a true proposition will match its corresponding fact constituent for constituent and structure for structure. So for example, the proposition that this is a piece of gold is true because there is a fact that is mirrored by the constituents and the structure of the proposition. Thus, the full explanation of truth, according to the fact-based correspondence theory, will appeal to the existence of a structured fact which is mirrored by a structured proposition. All right, so that's the classical correspondence theory in a nutshell. I think that so far, probably this picture of truth might sound okay as far as it goes. But if it sounds appealing now, That's only because we've attended to a relatively simple truth of subject-predicate form. The view actually becomes rather unwieldy once we start to consider truths with more complicated structure. Let's say that I don't have any apples in my hands. Then what fact would make the proposition, "There are no apples in my hand," true? Should we posit the existence of a negative fact to explain this? And if so, what would be its constituents? Do negative facts contain negations in them? Must such facts with negations in them really exist in order to make it true that there are no apples in my hand? Or consider the proposition that either this rock in my hand is gold or there is an apple in my hand. What kind of fact would make this true? Should we posit disjunctive facts with disjunctions in them as constituents, over and above the particular facts that explain the truth values of their disjuncts? Similar questions should be asked about other kinds of truths as well, such as subjunctive truths and generic truths and probabilistic truths. Do they require subjunctive facts and generic facts and so on? That would be kind of weird. It is, of course, open to the fact-based correspondence theorist to insist that such facts do indeed exist. I doubt that there's going to be any knockdown argument against them. Nonetheless, these considerations do expose a weakness in the view. So now, I'm just going to say a few words about why there's a weakness in the fact-based correspondence view, why the view is unsatisfying. Doing so will also point us in the direction of how we can improve upon the view. As I've already said, the fact-based correspondence theorist relies on an ontology of facts to explain truth. So for arbitrarily complex truths, they must then posit the existence of arbitrarily complex facts. I think that this is problematic for two reasons. For one, it's unsatisfying for the boring old reasons of parsimony. Philosophers generally think that all things considered, it would be better if we could explain things without hypothesizing the existence of many things. So there's that. That's one reason to be unsatisfied with the view. But there's also, I think, an even deeper problem here. The problem is that the fact-based view doesn't seem to really be all that explanatory. Look again at the explanation it offers for the truth of an arbitrary proposition. Whatever the syntactic form the proposition takes, the fact-based theory will just spit back a fact that matches its structure, and then claim that this is what explains truth. So for instance, why is it true that either this rock in my hand is gold or there's an apple in my hand? The fact-based theory will answer, well, because it's a fact that either this rock in my hand is gold or there's an apple in my hand. There's no real attempt made to explain how the structure of this proposition affects its truth conditions. It merely reifies the structure of the proposition into the entity that it claims to be the explanation, namely the fact. All of this shows that there is room for improving upon the fact-based correspondence theory. I think that it's worth doing another little historical digression now to explain how we can improve upon it, because it does point us in the right direction. So, as a matter of historical fact, Bertrand Russell was also very concerned about postulating complex and negative facts. So, at some point in the course of his career, he rejected the pure fact-based theory, which I just explained, which always seeks to explain truth by positing facts. Instead, he advocated for a mixed view called logical atomism. The basic idea here is that the only facts that exist are the simple positive ones. Facts such as, this is a piece of gold. These serve to explain all of the truth values of the atomic propositions. That is, the propositions that don't have any of the propositional logical connectives in them. Then, when it comes to more complex propositions, their truth values are explained by the operations of the truth functions of the connectives on the values of the atomic propositions. Take again my example of the truth that this is a rock in my hand, or this rock in my hand is a piece of gold, or there's an apple in my hand. The truth of the first disjunct, this rock in my hand is a piece of gold, is explained by the existence of a corresponding fact. The other disjunct, which says there's an apple in my hand, is false because there is no corresponding fact. Following this, the truth of the complex proposition is then explained by the first disjunct being true, along with the truth function associated with the connective or. The end result is that on Russellian logical atomism, truth is not to be understood as correspondence in all cases. The theory is actually pluralistic about the nature of truth. Truth is only correspondence to the facts for the atomic propositions, and it is explained recursively for complex propositions by the atomic truth values and the semantic operations of the logical connectives. I don't want to dwell on this view, logical atomism, for very long, but I do want to quickly point out that it does have several advantages over the pure fact-based theory. For one advantage, it doesn't have nearly the amount of ontological posits as the pure fact-based theory. Since it gets rid of all of the complex facts, it gets some points on the scoreboard for parsimony. And then, as a result of this advantage, it gets another advantage which I think is even more significant. Unlike the pure fact-based theory, logical atomism actually seeks to explain how the connectives of propositional logic interact with truth conditions. Logical atomism thus contains the seeds of a very powerful idea. The idea is that we can explain truth by essentially taking two steps. First, we explain how truth works for a small collection of simple things. For logical atomism, in this case, it's the atomic propositions. And then secondly, we explain how truth works for more complex things on the basis of their simpler parts. In a word, the idea is to explain truth by recursion. This is a very powerful and very neat idea. It's a giant step in the direction of actually explaining how truth conditions are generated on the basis of the structure of the truth bearer. And in fact, it's going to be one of the hallmarks of the theory of truth that I'm going to discuss in a second. But before we go into the main idea, I want to wrap up this discussion of older correspondence theories by pointing out that logical atomism still retains similar weaknesses to the pure fact-based theory that came before it. Logical atomism may be a step in the right direction, but it is only really a half measure. After all, it still retains the tactic of explaining truth for the atomic propositions by postulating a local ontology of facts. It explains the truth of this is a piece of gold by positing an entity, the fact. But one might wonder, wouldn't it be better if we could explain the truth of this thing without these weird complex entities called facts? In order for it to be true that this is a piece of gold in my hand, why does anything else have to exist besides this piece of gold and my hand and maybe the property of being gold? Maybe we can do without the facts and just talk about the objects themselves, like this piece of gold and the property it bears. I should say, it also seems to me that in ontology, that facts are a divisive issue amongst ontologists. Some see them as obviously innocent commitments, and others are just instinctively suspicious and prefer that we think of the only things that exist are the objects that populate the universe and their properties. At any rate, I think it would be preferable if we could design a theory of truth that sidesteps this metaphysical controversy. Another thing to observe is that logical atomism only explains the truth conditional contributions for the propositional connectives, just for and, or, if then, and not. It never really gives much of an explanation of the truth conditional contributions for the parts of propositions. There is, therefore, a lot more about the compositional nature of truth that can be explained. So this now finally sets me up to explain what I take to be the modern understanding of correspondence truth. Let me begin by saying that, unlike the classical fact-based theory, the ontology that we will begin with for this theory will just be the objects that we pre-theoretically take to inhabit the world. So we can admit of tables and chairs and people or whatever. Later on, we may also want to add properties or facts or sets or numbers or possible worlds or the other creatures of metaphysics if our ontology calls for it. But that will be settled later on by independent metaphysical considerations and not by the basic commitments of our theory of truth. With that said, let me now give you a very simple toy example of a theory of truth that will illustrate the approach that I have in mind. For the sake of the example, let's say that I utter the sentence, "This is gold." Now, what would it take to explain the truth of this sentence? Here's the suggestion. First, we explain the referential relations that my sentence's lexical parts bear to the worldly objects that they represent. So, for example, my use of the demonstrative "this" in my context refers to the rock that's in my hand. And presumably, there's going to be some explanation as to why this token of a word refers to this thing. And we can talk about what that explanation is in a little while. Also, my use of the predicate "is gold" will express the property of being gold. And it'll apply to all of the gold objects in virtue of their being gold. Again, there will be some explanation as to why the predicate expresses this property and applies to those objects. But we can bracket that question until later. The basic point for now is that each part of my sentence is a symbol, and it bears a referential relation to things. We can call the facts about those referential relations the primitive semantic facts, or we can call them the facts of reference. Following this, we can then say that the syntax of my sentence, which is the basic subject-predicate form, carries with it a semantic rule. This rule tells us how to combine or compose the semantic contributions of "this" and "is gold" into something that is either true or false. In effect, this rule tells us that the sentence attributes the property expressed by "is gold" to the object referred to by "this." Once we combine these pieces, we get the result that the sentence is true if and only if this is a piece of gold. Since it is a piece of gold, the sentence is true. All in all, we've now given some explanation of the truth of this sentence. Let me now just repeat the two big ideas that figure into this explanation. It's important for me to highlight them so that we can keep them in mind and realize that there's really two components to this theory. The first big idea is that simple expressions like names and demonstratives, predicates, nouns, verbs, they stand in referential relations. That is, relations between symbols and the things they symbolize. This is the theory of primitive reference, which is also sometimes called in the philosophical literature the theory of reference. The second big idea is that there are rules for combining the semantic properties of simpler expressions into the truth conditions for sentences, according to the syntactic form of the sentence. This is the theory of semantic composition. the theory of truth that we get is basically a synthesis of these two theories. So then, what is the nature of truth according to this theory? Well, the answer is that a sentence is true if its truth conditions are met. And its truth conditions are explained as a product of the primitive semantics of its simple parts, along with the rules of composition for its syntactic type. Okay, so that's the theory in a nutshell. We can call this the modern object-based correspondence theory. Having now laid it out, let me make several remarks about it, and then we'll go deeper into the nuts and bolts. So first of all, why do I call it the object-based correspondence theory? Well, the reason why we call it object-based is because it doesn't include this ontology of facts that the classical theories of Moore and Russell did. This theory doesn't need to commit to the existence of facts. It just needs the existence of objects for the singular terms to refer to and the predicates to apply to. And perhaps it needs properties for the predicates to express. Moreover, the reason why I call it a correspondence theory is because it respects the basic intuition that truth is a matter of representing things as they are. Well, according to this theory, truth is a matter of referring to things and then attributing to them the properties that they have. Since this theory retains this basic insight that truth is a matter of representing portions of the world as it really is, it deserves to count as a correspondence theory. All right, so second remark. I stress that this correspondence theory is the synthesis of two theories, the theory of reference or primitive semantics and the theory of compositional semantics. Well, each of these pieces are extremely big topics in their own right. In fact, I think it would probably be better to say that each of them are ongoing areas of research, and that they each have fairly vast literatures. In order to give an overview of the current state and prospects for this correspondence theory, I will have to say something about both of them, and I'm going to do that fairly soon. For the most part, for the rest of this video, I'm going to try to give a bird's eye view of the theory of reference and the theory of compositional semantics as it pertains to the correspondence theory of truth. That's going to come in a bit. The final remark that I have to make is about truthbearers. If you were listening carefully, you may have noticed that I switched the truthbearers when we changed our discussion from the classical correspondence theory to the one that I'm now discussing. With the classical fact-based correspondence theory, it was largely assumed that truth is primarily a property of propositions, whatever those are. But now, when I'm speaking of this modern object-based theory, I've switched to talking about sentences, that is, items of language. So what gives? Why the change? Well, the main reason is that it is convenient for the sake of exposition. So remember, one of the main claims of the correspondence theory is that truth conditions are explained by compositional rules that are sensitive to syntax. Well, we have a fairly good grasp on the syntax of sentences. So sentences make a good, easy to understand case of the sorts of things that can be true according to this theory. Whereas propositions, on the other hand, we don't really know what they are. Of course, there are philosophical theories about this, but there is no theory that isn't contentious. So, for this reason, it's harder to develop this theory at first if we're just paying attention to propositions. It may be, in the end, and after all, that there are propositions and they exhibit the right sort of compositional structure so that this theory of truth works for them. As I see it, this approach to understanding truth doesn't rule that possibility out. At first, it can be relatively neutral about the domain of truth-bearers. All it requires is that truth-bearers be sufficiently language-like That is, they have to be items of symbolic systems of referential semantics for its simple parts and rules for semantic composition based on syntax. That could be a whole lot of things. And for the last part of this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the options. So we can now start getting into the details of the different parts of this theory. Let's start with the idea of compositional semantics. When I presented the toy version of the account earlier, I gave the sample sentence, "This is gold," which has a very simple subject-predicate form. And because the syntactic structure of this sentence is very simple, it is pretty easy to state the rule for semantic composition. Basically, the sentence is true if the predicate term applies to the thing referred to by the subject term. Now, one of the reasons why this modern object-based correspondence theory isn't so straightforward to articulate in full generality is because most sentences just aren't this simple. Within any natural language that humans actually speak, the variety of sentence structure is huge. So one of the research tasks for fleshing out the correspondence theory is to provide the rules for semantic composition for the whole variety of syntactic structures. Moreover, we'd also want to do this in a fairly systematic way. Ideally, the rules should be recursive, so that we can explain how a potential infinite number of sentences can have their truth conditions, based on only a finite stock of rules. At this point, I would just like to make a historical comment about this project. The project of providing a compositional semantics that matches the full variety of sentential syntactic structure is really a project of the 20th and the 21st century. The tools that we now have to do this sort of thing weren't really available prior to then. In fact, in the early modern period of philosophy, it was very common for philosophers to try to assimilate all judgments to the subject-predicate form. The reason they did this is because they were dogmatically motivated by Aristotle's syllogistic logic. Anyway, sometime later, at the turn of the 20th century, it became apparent to Gottlob Frege that this old logical system wasn't good enough. So he single-handedly developed a more powerful logical system that eventually became the quantificational logic that we now teach in logic class. And also, it's important to say that when Frege developed this new logic, one of the key innovations that he made was that he developed new ways of parsing the syntax of sentences. And these syntactic developments turned out to be more fruitful in tracking logical entailments between sentences and composing the truth conditions of complex sentences than what was available prior to then. This is, by the way, one of the main reasons why I want to call this correspondence theory the modern correspondence theory. That is because there's a real sense in which this understanding of truth will piggyback on certain intellectual accomplishments in logic and linguistics and semantics that simply weren't available to pre-20th century philosophers. So, whether you like it or not, the story that I'm telling is a story of philosophical progress. So, let's go back to the main train of thought. There are two intellectual disciplines that have been a source of progress in our understanding of compositional semantics. In particular, these disciplines are logic and linguistics. I'm going to try to briefly describe what we get from both of these disciplines. And I'm going to start with logic. The main accomplishment in logic that is important for us is a certain famous theory of truth that we get from the Polish mathematician Alfred Tarski. In the truth literature, we always call this Tarski's theory of truth. Basically, if I'm going to describe the accomplishment of Tarski as briefly as I can, I would say this. Tarski is important because he gave us a fully systematic, explicit theory of truth and semantic composition for a central, circumscribed class of artificial formal languages. To be a little bit less brief, Tarski is concerned to explain truth specifically for the formal languages that we design for the systems of what is called first order or quantificational logic. These are the languages that we use when we're doing proofs in quantificational logic. This would be familiar to anyone who's taken a first year class in logic. A sentence like, all dogs bark, will get rendered into this formal language as something like, for all x, if x is a dog, then x barks. Anyway, it's important to stress that the first order languages that Tarski is interested in are artificial languages. What this means is that they are languages that are literally intelligently designed by an artificer. This is key because it means that the artificer of these languages has the power to stipulate certain properties of these languages. In particular, we can stipulate exactly what the syntactic structure is, and then once stipulated, there can be no further question as to what the real syntactic structure is. Likewise, the artificer can also stipulate the primitive semantic properties, for example, reference, of the simple expressions. So if I'm setting up a formal language, I can just stipulate that the V means disjunction, and that the squiggle means negation, and that A refers to Bob, or B refers to Sally, or whatever. And once I've stipulated these things, there's really no further mystery as to why these expressions mean what they do. They mean what they do because I designed the language so that they mean these things. So, all in all, this means that the languages that Tarski is interested in are highly controlled environments. He also makes the other stipulation that these languages won't contain their own truth predicate. This is just a bit of an aside, but this means that we can formulate within these languages, it means that we cannot formulate within these languages a sentence like, this sentence is false. And so we can completely sidestep the troubles that come from the liar's paradox. Anyway, with all of these control that we have over these languages, it makes it relatively straightforward to define truth by rules of semantic composition. It's especially easy to define the rules of composition in terms of the syntax of the language because the syntax is explicitly laid out in the definition of the language. This is the definition of a well-formed formula that we recursively define for these formal languages. Tarski does for these formal languages exactly what we would want a correspondence theory to do. He gives recursive rules for generating the truth conditions for an arbitrary sentence based on the syntactic structure and the semantic properties of its simplest parts. And so, from Tarski, we can see how truth can work for sentences that are a lot more complicated than the simple subject-predicate ones, like in the toy example that I presented earlier. In fact, what we get is the truth conditions for any sentence of the language of quantificational logic. I'm not really going to get into the details of it, of how he did his formal definition. That's because throughout this video, I want to try to stay at the level of engaging with the philosophy and the history. I don't really want to get into the details of the technical formal stuff. So let me just say a bit more about the philosophical significance of Tarski's definition. One thing that I need to repeat again and again about Tarski is that his theory of truth is only directly relevant to the truth of sentences of artificial formal languages. Tarski himself had no ambitions to explain truth for sentences of natural language, which he regarded to be a lot more complicated and intractable. He also had no interest in explaining truth for thought or propositions, whatever those are. So for himself, he set very limited ambitions. Nonetheless, his theory is still significant for a number of reasons. One reason that is totally uncontentious is that his theory of truth has fruitful applications in mathematics and in logic. In fact, his theory of truth was the seminal contribution to model theory, which has widespread application in mathematics and logic. But we don't really need to get into that. What's more controversial, though, is the extent to which Tarskys' theory can inform us about the nature of truth that's beyond its limited sphere. In particular, we might want to know how much can his definition tell us about truth for natural languages. This is something that philosophers have debated ever since Tarski. One of the chief contributions to this debate is a paper by Hartree-Field in the 70s called Tarskys' Theory of Truth. In this paper, Field outlines a vision for giving a correspondence theory of truth very much like the one I'm trying to articulate here. He thinks that truth can be explained in broad outline in the same way, which is that you give a theory of reference for the simple stuff and a theory of composition to explain truth for complex stuff. Now, Field, in this paper, he recognizes that Tarski never says anything that could bear on the theory of reference for natural language. Since Tarski is interested in artificial formal languages, he gets to explain reference for free by just stipulating it. But when it comes to languages that are not artificial, we need to say a lot more about how reference works. Nonetheless, Field is optimistic that we can appropriate the recursive compositional rules provided by Tarski and then use them to explain truth in a more general setting. He envisioned a grand theory where we take a theory of reference and then combine them with Tarski's rules, and then we will have explained truth completely for both formal and natural languages. And as for the theory of reference, Field was writing in the 1970s, and so he gestures towards a causal theory of reference, whereby the referent of a name, say, is explained by tracing the name's causal history. Field's paper is, to my knowledge, the first paper that actually says that we can explain correspondence truth by synthesizing the theory of reference with a theory of compositional semantics. So it is, I guess, the forefather of the kind of correspondence theory that I'm outlining here. His paper thus deserves a lot of credit. However, once we've given it this credit, there are also a few shortcomings that we need to attend to. For one thing, the theory of reference turned out to be a lot more complicated than Field seems to imagine it will be back when he was writing in the 70s. We'll get back to that later. But for now, I want to stress that there's also a few problems with trying to shoehorn natural language sentences into Tarski's theory of semantic composition. Tarski's theory simply was not designed to handle the syntax of natural language. And there are many ways in which natural language sentences are a lot more complicated than the language of first-order logic. On the one hand, there are sentences of natural language that cannot really be translated into something with the first-order syntax. So, for instance, there are sentences with modal operators, probabilistic sentences, higher-order quantifiers, other types of conditionals besides the material conditional. There's generics and just a whole bunch of sentences where Tarski's theory just simply wouldn't work. And then as for the other source of problems, even when we can translate a natural language sentence into the language of first-order logic, it's still often not the case that the original sentence will have the same syntax as its formal translation. So for example, all dogs bark gets translated into for all x, if x is a dog, then x barks. But the English sentence doesn't have any variables in it or any conditionals, and it's just a heck of a lot more simple syntactically than the quantificational translation. So what can we say about this? Well, as a matter of fact, there are numerous disciplines that are devoted to solving problems like this. In the logic tradition, in the second half of the 20th century, there were numerous expansions of first-order logic designed to handle other stuff like modal operators and higher-order quantifiers and stuff like that. Just as an aside, it's of course needs to be mentioned that the interpretation of these systems brings up problems that first-order logic doesn't bring up for the philosophical interpretation of these systems. So, case in point, modal logic raises questions about ontology. Namely, do we need to believe in possible worlds? But I don't want to get too sidetracked, so let's just bracket that issue. The point is, there's tons of work here that is highly relevant to the correspondence theorist purposes. The other problem we need to face has to do with the fact that natural language sentences don't typically have the syntax of first-order languages, even when they're translatable as such. So, what can we say about this? One thing that we can say is that the first-order artificial languages still provide an excellent representation of the semantic properties of natural language sentences. I think that for the purposes of understanding truth, we can think of these formal languages as a kind of representational instrument. What they do is they simplify and approximate and idealize the compositional character of the truth conditions for a substantial portion of natural language. And by and large, for a person who is just casually interested in understanding how truth works, that's probably good enough. But if that isn't good enough, then there's also another batch of inquiry that I can direct you towards. This time, we would be heading over to the linguistics department. The research program that's being conducted over there is called the Pragian semantic program, and it's done in the generative tradition. The basic idea here is that the theory of generative grammar, developed by Noam Chomsky, supplies for us the actual syntactic structure of the living, breathing sentences of real natural language. And so, if we want the real theory of compositional semantics for natural language, we had better respect that syntax. And so what the linguist does is they take that syntax and then they assign denotations to each of the lexical items that the syntax delivers for the purpose of explaining compositional semantics. That's the Pragian program in a nutshell. The reason why it's called Pragian is because it takes an insight from Frege about how semantic composition works. Basically, the model of composition that they use is that of functions applied to arguments to yield outputs. So what the semanticist does is they assign denotations to the expressions that are either objects or functions, and then they explain semantic composition by functions getting applied to those objects. In short, the model for compositional semantics that they use is functional application. Just as another aside, once again, there are also a host of philosophical questions that we might want to ask about how to understand the ontology of this whole thing. Namely, must we believe that functions exist? And also, how do we square the denotations provided by this approach to semantics with our intuitive judgments about meaning? But we're not going to get into those here. So, I imagine that I've just spat out a lot of information that all went by very quickly. And all of it was just a very high-level description of what's going on in logic and linguistics. But let's zoom out again and get back to the big picture. The overarching point is that the correspondence theory, as I've been explaining it, it needs a systematic recursive theory that explains truth conditions of complex things in terms of the semantic properties of simple things by rules of composition. Well, sure enough, there are tons of theories that do this sort of thing. I just gave an overview of tons of research that does this sort of thing. So, now, the linguists and the logicians may not have all of it worked out. And certainly we wouldn't be able to write down everything that they've delivered onto a post-it note. So the correspondence theory cannot just simply be stated. But there are several recognizable research programs here. And we have every reason to believe that progress is being made on our understanding of truth, at least with respect to this aspect of it right now. So that wraps up one of the central pillars of the object-based correspondence theory. As I said, semantic composition seems mostly to be the business of logic and linguistics. As philosophers, we can probably take the attitude of, well, let's just let the logicians and the linguists figure it out. But the other pillar of the correspondence theory presents questions and problems that are more at home in philosophy. This is, as I've said, the theory of reference. It is the theory of what simple, mostly non-logical expressions contribute to truth conditions. Or in other words, it is the theory of how the basic symbols represent the things that they symbolize. For example, of how names refer to objects, or how predicates apply to things. It is concerned with word-world relations. It's worth pointing out that there's really two clusters of questions here. One of them is just simply, what do words represent? What are the reference of the names? What does this name refer to? What does this predicate apply to? In philosophical parlance, these are called semantic questions because they're questions about what the semantic properties of words are. It's just a matter of identifying what the semantic contribution of each expression is. But there's also a deeper and probably more difficult question of how to explain the semantic properties. We might also want to know why words represent what they do. Why does this name refer to that object, or that predicate apply to that object? In short, what explains reference? This kind of question is called metasemantics in contemporary philosophical parlance. When it comes to explaining the nature of truth, in the vein of this object-based correspondence theory, I think that the metasemantic questions are just as important as the semantic questions. Semantics will only take us as far as identifying what the truth conditions of each sentence in fact is. But it doesn't tell us why a sentence has the truth conditions that it has. And presumably, if you're in the business of explaining truth, this is one of the things that you'd want to explain. Moreover, the theories of compositional semantics never touch on the questions of metasemantics. They just take it for granted that the simple expressions mean what they do, and then they interest themselves in the combinations. So linguistics, by and large, leaves it wide open how we should think about metasemantics. So, what can we say about metasemantics? Well, just like the other component of the correspondence theory, we can observe that there emerged a recognizable line of theorizing in the second half of the 20th century devoted to these kinds of questions. But this time, the literature is to be found mostly within the philosophy of mind and language, and occasionally in the intersection of philosophy and cognitive science. Let me say up front, though, that if you want to subscribe to the kind of correspondence theory that I've been talking about, then there is already an a priori limitation on the kinds of theories of reference that are available to you. You can think about it this way. The correspondence theory seeks to explain truth by appealing to composition and primitive reference. It thus follows that for this theory, reference must come before truth in the order of metasemantic explanation. It follows then that you have to explain reference for the simple expressions in relative isolation from each other. You have to explain it atomistically. Since the semantic properties of the primitive expressions are the basic building blocks of the theory, they must be explained in relative isolation from each other and without invoking the notion of truth. So this means in particular that you can't explain reference holistically, or you can't explain it in terms of the inferential relations that expressions bear to each other, since plausibly inferential relations are to be understood in terms of entailment, which invokes a prior notion of truth. So this is just my way of saying that this view of truth is not compatible with Davidsonian holism or inferential role semantics. So then, what kinds of theories of reference can we appeal to? Generally, the metasemantic theories that are left are the ones that fall under the general heading of productivism. These are the theories that generally seek to explain the semantic facts of an expression in terms of the facts concerning how the expression was produced. So for example, when I utter, "This is a piece of gold," my use of the expression "this" is produced with a certain state of mind where I have a referential intention. And my intention to refer to this thing, the content of this intention is explained, at least in part, by me having a prior perceptual state in relation to this thing. So there's a whole bunch of causal steps working backwards from the production of my speech through my states of mind to the item that I referred to. The productivist metasematicists would try to explain the semantic properties of my expression in terms of all of this causal history. Now, there's a lot of literature in the 20th century in philosophy that attempts to do this sort of thing. So famously, Kripke and Putnam advocated for the causal theory of reference in the 70s, and Donnellan and Kaplan each have stories to tell about how referential intentions are supposed to work to explain the reference of names and demonstratives, respectively. All in all, there's a lot of stuff here. But I guess if I'm just going to stay at the level of exploring big themes, one of the main themes I'd like to bring out concerning the theory of reference is that this issue of explaining reference is greatly affected by other very big picture philosophical ideas. In particular, it's affected by whether one favors a general naturalist outlook or not. So if you don't care about naturalism and you subscribe to some sort of mind-body dualism, then you can probably live with the idea that the mind has an irreducible and inexplicable power to just refer to things. And if that's your view, then this kind of correspondence theory of truth will be relatively easier for you to articulate. But to my mind, it'll also be rather unsatisfying. On the other hand, if you're a naturalist, then you would also want to give your theory of reference in such a way that explains how referential properties of mind and language fit generally into the naturalistic picture. Throughout the 1980s, there was a program in Metasemantics that was intent on doing exactly that. It was called the Naturalizing Content Program, and it was mostly led by Fred Dretske, Jerry Fodor, and Ruth Millikan. Their stated goal was to explain in naturalistic terms referential relations as they pertain not to words, but to mental representations. And so they produced various theories that were designed to do this. Dretske and Fodor had informational semantic theories, and Millikan had a teleosemantic theory. Each of these philosophers sought to explain how primitive reference can arise out of natural relations that pertain between organisms and their natural environments. The philosophers who were involved in this naturalizing content program each had reductionist ambitions. They wanted to state in naturalistic terms both necessary and sufficient conditions for one thing to refer to another. For this reason, their aim was actually very ambitious. In fact, I think it's fair to say that their aims were too high. Theoretical reduction is very difficult to pull off. It's hardly ever the case in either philosophy or the sciences that we can successfully reduce one thing to another. We can hardly ever state non-vacuous necessary and sufficient conditions for the obtaining of something. There's a reason that whenever we talk about theoretical reduction, we always use the same hackneyed examples of water and H2O. It's because it's the only examples we have. I think it's fair to say that most philosophers have also come around to this point, that the model of philosophical explanation should not be reduction. We shouldn't try to explain reference by reducing it to some other thing. At some point in Naming a Necessity, Kripke says something like, reference is what it is and it isn't anything else. He never says that his causal picture is a theory of reference. He just says it's a picture of reference designed to illuminate the sorts of states of affairs that are relevant to fixing reference. I think Kripke's right about this. I think that it's misguided to seek all like out and out reductions of the reference relation. So where would that leave us? I think it puts us in a pretty decent position to appreciate just what we need to do for the sake of a correspondence theory of truth. The correspondence theory requires an explanation of reference, but we shouldn't require a reductive explanation of reference. Rather, we should develop theories insofar as we can as to the sorts of states of affairs that determine or explain reference whenever it occurs. I don't think we need to reduce reference once and for all. I think we can work in a highly piecemeal fashion and treat different terms in different subjects as separate cases and build theories one by one. Once again, I sort of think that this is the trend that philosophy is going, especially in some circles, but I also don't want to sound overly confident because it's not so clear-cut what the philosophical trends are all the time. Lastly, what should we think about the products of the naturalized content program? What good is, say, Fodor's informational semantics if it doesn't succeed in reducing reference completely? I do think that there is a value in this program. I think that it provides models for how to explain some occurrences of the reference relation by appealing to natural phenomena. And I think that this is especially useful dialectically if say, you're in a debate with a non-naturalist that thinks that semantics is inherently spooky and in principle impossible to square with the naturalistic outlook. Well, maybe I can't quell their skepticism by giving a type reduction of reference. But if instead I can sketch a story of how, say, this token can relate to the rock in my hand in terms of cognitive and computational processes going on in my head and the antecedent perceptual relations that I bear to the rock, then hopefully that'll be enough to allay their worries. Okay, so hopefully I've now given enough of a bird's eye view overview of the two central components of the object-based correspondence theory. Just to repeat them once again, they are the theory of compositional semantics and the theory of primitive reference. Hopefully I've said enough to give a sense of what's happened in both of these. Each of them, I'll stress again, are not small beans where I can just tell you what the results are. They are vast areas of research that span several disciplines. This is why I say that the modern correspondence theory is a synthesis of several research programs, such that, when combined, their products jointly inform us about truth. There is still now one more issue that I need to take up, and this is the issue of truthbearers. I've been putting it off, and now I have to come back to it. When I talked about semantic composition, we talked about sentences of artificial languages and sentences of natural language. These provide a good subject for semantic composition because their syntax is relatively understood. In the artificial case, it's perfectly understood. Then, when I started talking about reference, I drifted from talking about language to talking about mental representations. So what gives? Why did I do this? Also, you might wonder, what does this theory of truth have to say about truth for beliefs, or thoughts, or judgments? Can't these things also be true? And if so, what can the theory say about them? Well, in order to answer this, we would need to know more about what a belief is. It is standardly thought that belief is a state that is to be understood as a relation. A subject believes that P, if they stand in a certain relation, the believing relation, to a proposition that P. A belief is true if the proposition that one is thus related to is true. But then, this just takes us one step back to the question of what is a proposition? And again, there's lots of different views on the market here. There's nothing I can say about what a proposition is that won't be controversial. But rather than getting into those weeds, I will instead point out that, once again, the general architecture of the theory of truth places a pretty steep constraint on the sorts of things that can be the truth bearers. If truth conditions are a product of primitive semantics and semantic composition, then whatever can be true or false must be the kind of thing that is amenable to both of those things. In other words, the truth bearers must be items that belong to a system of representation that is relatively language-like. It must be language-like in the sense that it has simple syntactic parts that enter into symbol-object relations like reference. Secondly, its vehicles of truth and falsity must be syntactically complex constructs out of these simple parts. And lastly, its truth conditions must be explained by compositional rules that are sensitive to that syntax. So again, are propositions amongst the truth bearers? Well, again, that depends on what propositions are. If they fit those criteria, then sure. If not, then we'll just have to get by without propositions. With that said, there is hope for explaining truth for the intentional attitudes like belief, thought, and desire with this kind of correspondence theory. However, it rests on the assumption of a certain empirical theory of how the mind works, one which we get from Jerry Fodor. This is Fodor's representational theory of mind, which he claims to be one of the empirical conjectures which is the cornerstone of cognitive science. The basic claim here is that believing, thinking, desiring, or having any sort of intentional attitude is always a three-way relation. The relation is between a subject, a mental representation and the content of the representation. A mental representation for Fodor is basically a language-like vehicle of semantic content, which is hypothesized to be within the architecture of the mind. The mental representations are language-like precisely because they meet the three requirements of language-like truth-bearers that I just outlined. Namely, the system of mental representations is supposed to be composed of a finite stock of syntactically simple symbols which bear mind-world relations like reference. The complex representations are built up by certain syntactic rules, and the semantics of the complex representations is determined by the semantics of their simple parts and rules for composition. Fodor sometimes calls these representations the language of thought. Actually, he doesn't sometimes call it that. It's the title of 2 of his books. In short, if Fodor is right about how the mind works, then our correspondence theory has another domain of truth-bearers, the mental representations. If he's right, then we're now off to the races for accommodating belief, desire, thought, and the rest of the intentional states within our theory of truth. But I must stress, it isn't at all an a priori philosophical theory. It is an empirical hypothesis about how the mind works. It's supposed to be empirically confirmed by its ability to explain certain data about human thought and behavior. Fodor, of course, thinks that there's a host of good reasons to posit these mental representations. In particular, they allow him to explain mental processes as computations over mental representations. It also allows him to explain the systematicity and productivity of our thought. That is, our ability to keep thinking new thoughts and rearranging the old ones. But we also need to be mindful that the representational theory of mind may, in the end, turn out to be false. Perhaps a future science of the mind will end up discarding it. At present, I have no idea how to assess this. I'm in no position. I'm not a cognitive scientist. But I guess we can say that here's another element of the theory of truth that rests on development in the special sciences. Okay, so conclusion. This is all I'm going to say about the correspondence theory for now. Hopefully I've said enough to explain the general architecture of the theory and give a feel for how filling out the details rests in the hands of various ongoing projects. I think that's all I want to say for now. Maybe next time, if I can get around to it, I'll make a follow-up video describing all of the challenges that are faced by this approach to understanding truth. In this video, I was the voice of optimism, but somebody also needs to play the pessimist, and maybe next time that'll be me. That's not to say, though, that I don't ultimately like this view of truth. In fact, I do like it quite a bit, but I also have to be honest about its weaknesses. I'm not going to do that now.